Okay, the motion for debate today, this House believes that international aid should prioritize disaster relief over military support, and the proposition is the code, and the opposition is the SDC theme of NTB. Without any further ado, let's start the debate. I'm going to start my speech in three, two, one. Under the motion, this House believes that international aid should prioritize disaster relief over military support, meaning that as the positions, we don't want to put military support as the priority of the donors, in this case, developed nations or the any institutions who give the aid to the military support. And we want to propose that they have to prioritize disaster relief over military support. Let's take a look what's going on in status quo regarding the international aid conducted by those donors in current situations. And when support superpower countries currently spend too much on military and offer disaster relief or any other humanitarian aid, ladies and gentlemen. Declare calculating more work in that place, ladies and gentlemen. And also, all we know that this military support spend a lot of money, too much money, compared to only giving the aid in cases like in the famine in Africa, for example, like flood in Pakistan and also in Libya, or even earthquake in Indonesia, ladies and gentlemen. And compared to this kind of the situation, we believe that when we donate more, giving the aids to the military support, offer the disaster relief, we believe that it spends too much money and even doesn't give better situations for the global stability, ladies and gentlemen. And this is the impact. International aid become more into this destructive movements when they only focusing or even prioritize military support or for the disaster relief, ladies and gentlemen. And for example, like at the beginning, for example, when they send the military troops, for example, or the peacekeeping movement to some conflict area like Israel versus Palestine, and Russia, then what will be happen? They have to spend much money to support this war, which is also bringing something worse and condition compared to only focusing on the disaster relief, ladies and gentlemen. And this kind of the situation, it's really harms to toward the global stability, and we don't want this happens anymore in our status quo, and we want to propose by forcing them to prioritize disaster relief over military support, ladies and gentlemen. And now comes our definitions as the proposition. Number one, what do we mean by international aid? Is from international institutions like United Nations, for example, IMF, for example, WHO through United Nations, for example, or even developed countries like United States of America, China, or Russia, and Israel, ladies and gentlemen. In countries, for example, like United Nations, they're only focusing on helping the world or the conflict countries, the conflict areas by sending the troops, for example, by sending the military support like weapon, for example. And this kind of the cost is really expensive compared to prioritizing this disease relief, and which is also harms not only for the world is in that destination country, but also for them as the donors or as the one who donates the support, ladies and gentlemen. And also our model, we believe that this is urgent to support this because we believe that compared to the military support, national disaster relief center, we believe that it is more urgent because compared to the countries work, ladies and gentlemen. At the very first beginning, even if maybe the opposition, the number of victims in the world is bigger compared to the natural disaster. But we believe that at the very first beginning, the urgency should be more urgent when we see the number of victims of disaster, natural disaster. Because of what? The numbers of victims in the world, for example, is happening after they send the peacekeeper, they send the troops to declare a more war in that place. This is what actually the numbers of victims at the very first beginning comparing to the disaster on hard countries. And we believe that the urgency is still urgent in my position as the proposition. And all we also situation. The situations of like famine or starving in Africa, for example, is really important to focus on this kind of the situation because the global economic stability lead into the starving, lead into the famine issues in some countries, not only in Africa, even in many countries like in Asia, especially, for example, like in Asia, for example. And this happens, or the problems also shows how urgent us to prioritize disaster relief over military support. And now come to my argument as the first proposition. As the first proposition, I'm going to prove to you on how by prioritizing disaster relief, it will show us how our commitment to support the humanitarian principles in saving life first goal in political reasons supporting the military the military support at the very first beginning. And the second speaker prove to you how by let the country, the donors or the institutions to send the military support or for disaster relief, it leads into something more chaotic in terms of the stability, especially global stability. And this is harmful for everyone, not only for the conflicting country, but also for global community and global society, and including their own country as raise the budget for the military support. And I'll come to my argument as the first proposition. I'm going to prove to you how by prioritizing disaster relief over military support, it support the utilitarian principle, saving life first. What's it called? Most of the United Nations cases, for example, when they send the troop, when they send the peacekeeper, for example, in a designated country like in Israel, like in Palestine, like in Gaza, like in Pakistan or India, like in Ukraine and Russia, and most of the reason behind this agenda, they just the vision is to create peace, ladies and gentlemen. We assume this is a very assumptive objective from the beginning because at the end of the day, most of the countries, developed countries who send the military support, mostly they support the allies, the supporting countries, for example, like United States only support Israel, United States only support Kuwait. It don't support of the side his thought on how this kind of the military is, support or aid shows in neutral what's called position as the opponent hurters. As all we know that the principle of giving the aid, we have to be neutral. And we believe that prioritizing disaster relief, it leads into the something that is more natural compared to the military support, which is imbalanced support to the donors. Why? Because their alliance, their alliance. This is really bad for the what's called the goal or the objective of the humanitarian principle or the age principle at the first beginning. And second of all, that this neutrality is becoming a very if they have to prove that on how by sending more on disaster relief compared to their support, they will be have attracting the global image from the society. Is also important for their countries, for example. Why? For example, when you show the commitment to support any other countries because of the natural disaster, it shows the commitment for global movement, in this case of, about the humanitarian movement. At the end of the day, for economic stability, which also harms because of the military support status quo. This vision we are proud to propose. Thank you. On the positions, I would like to invite the first opposition or leader of opposition. The
Okay. Am I audible? I'm going to start my speech in three, two, one. Ladies and gentlemen, they have assumed that the proposition side has assumed that prioritizing disaster relief over military support is something that should happen and implemented. It's something that is urgent to happen. But they never give us the concrete reason as to why it should be urgent. It should be as fast as possible to be implemented. They never give us the reasons why. We support military support, and we support that international community should be given military support because of how effective it is to handle all the conflicts around the world. In contrast to international aid, they've given us that for they've given us, for example, the Israel and Palestine conflicts. For example, it's not solved until this day. Just it's because that they've only given them international aid for months, and it's the proof is it's never been solved. The conflict's never been solved. It's because it's not the international aid is only temporary solutions. It's not a permanent solutions, and that's why we think that military support can solve the very root of what is happening in those Israel and Palestine conflict. So it can because the disaster overall that is mentioned on this motion, this disaster overall said by the proposition team is solely comes from human conflicts and human wars. They never, and that is why we, as the opposition team of this motion, opposes this motion. Before moving on to our arguments, we'll first like to rebut some of the points made by the proposition team. So they said that it harms for global community because we put international aid for these countries that are at wars. For example, Syria. For example, countries in Africa that has had civil wars for years and years and years and decades. They think that it harms for global community, but it is, but international aid doesn't really solve what is happening in those countries. For example, in South Africa, they've been going on civil wars for decades now. It's not been solved. The international community, like the United Nations that they have mentioned, only been giving them international aid for example, food, clothes, and other essential supplies. It's not never been solved because it is just shows that how ineffective and how not important it is for aid is only given them temporary solutions as to solve the current situations. And the people will only be fed for like a day or a week at most, and then what's happened next? They're going to be starved to death and or going to be kidnapped by these revolutionaries people that takes over the government, that is the anarchists. And what are the solutions to this? We think that international community should focus more on military support rather than prioritizing disaster relief because just of how important it is. They've never given us the arguments. They've never given us the proof on how effective that on how it will solve the main root of the problem by prioritizing disaster relief. And then they said that it's peacekeepers needs to have a choice. They said that the peacekeepers sent by the United Nations can be neutral because they either have to support one side or the other. But we think the former. We think that peacekeepers in the United Nations can create some sort of a neutral zone, some sort of a peace zone, as to then create something that can both parties of the conflicts can work on. It is going to start the peace deals that is being said because international aid doesn't really have any of those perks that can happen, and military support is a essential thing to happen. And then moving on to our arguments, we have 4 arguments on why we support this motion. First, disaster is caused by human conflicts. Second, prioritizing disaster relief is ineffective. Third, security comes first. And then fourth, military aid prevents bigger disasters. I, as the first speaker, will present 2 of our main arguments, and then my second speaker will present the third and fourth. So first, about disaster is caused by human conflicts. So disaster is caused by wars. What are the impacts? The impacts are famines and poverty. Is caused by these. Those are caused by these conflicts. So it's better to solve to those conflicts from the roots. It's not better to solve this only by temporary methods like prioritiz- prioritizing disaster relief by international aid. It's not effective way to solve the whole problem as a whole. So the proposition side has not yet present the arguments on why or how this disaster relief can solve the whole conflict as the full picture. They only given the arguments on solving this by a temporary scale. And then the famines is and then moving on to our second argument, it's prioritizing disaster relief is ineffective. As I've said, prioritizing disaster is not prioritizing disaster relief is not ineffective because it only halts the progress of the conflicts by only supporting the people that are suffering, not the main or not the main conflicts of those conflicts. For example, we'll take it as the Africa in Israel and Palestine. They've never the people that in the international global community, they've only given them international aid and not have the United Nations have not put troops in the Israel and Palestine stage. So it's actually so prioritizing disaster relief is not really important as to now the Palestine and Israel doesn't the conflict isn't solved yet. And we'll take another example. For example, Ukraine and Russia. The global community have been in full support of Ukraine. They've given them international aid. They've given them weapons. But what has happened? They're still being invaded. We should give the United Nations we should prioritize the United Nations to give military support to Ukraine as to solve the whole problem as a whole. In conclusion, we do not think that disaster giving international aid to people of wars is useless or not is useless or anything. But we think that giving them military support solves the issues as a whole and is much more effective than just giving them temporary solutions as to this are the foods and clothes and whatever, but they still suffer every day from the wars, from the conflicts that are happening outside of their house. That is why we, as the opposition team, are very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The leader of opposition has spent 8 minutes and 3 seconds. Cool. Now, to continue the arguments from the oppositions, I invite the Deputy Prime Minister. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Remember, a peacekeeping support in Iraq and also Afghanistan. At the end of the day, it didn't bring something better conditions for those countries at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. This is what won't happen again in any conflicting countries in around the world, ladies and gentlemen. If you remember, if you do remember what happened in Afghanistan, at the end of the day, they killed the presidents, and then the people were starving, and until now, the economic stability there is still very poor, ladies and gentlemen. You cannot even finish or plan and end up with the what's called better what's called peaceful situations or better condition and so on and so forth, ladies and gentlemen. Then after they escalated the war in Afghanistan and also Iraq, and what happened? Then they got back home. The military from the U.S., for example, they got back home. They did not even develop more on the countries as they are promising at the very first place. And because of that, we believe that any types of military support will never bring something better conditions for those countries. And now come to my what's called rebuttals before moving on to my arguments toward the first proposition. And they assume that disaster prioritizing the disaster relief over military support is only solve the what's called temporary temporary what's called problems. For example, they shows us the examples in South Africa or in Africa, and they see the case of famine and the case of starving there that it has never end up until now, and still many people are starving there, ladies and gentlemen. Even if the WHO giving food, for example. But at the end of the day, it doesn't solve the root of the problems. And we don't think so. Why then we want to propose those sectors to prioritize disaster relief compared to military support? Because in status quo, as has been mentioned by my first speaker, at the very first beginning, most of the donors, like United Nations or IMF or the developed countries, they prioritize the military support offered disaster relief. Even if they go to the Africa to help people who are starving, but they don't give a proper food and proper programs how to solve them. That's why we want to force them to prioritize by not only sending the foods or temporary foods, for example, by but we need more programs beyond that to create what's called to give more funding toward the disaster relief in order they can provide better what's called services for those who are it, ladies and gentlemen. This is what we are proposing in our proposal. That's why we don't want the temporary effects or impacts given to the destination country will be accepted anymore. But prioritizing disaster relief, it will have chance to them to solve the root of the problems as been worried by the opposition. And second of all, they also believe the root of the problem is the war, the conflict of the people there, because the stability of the people there or the what's called the conflicts also into the difficulty of those countries to also cover every single problem, including disaster or also the famine issue, for example, in this country. Yes, but as the to you in the very first beginning on how the conflict become escalated because of the peacekeeping. If we can see, if you can open your eyes on how at the very first beginning the domestic war, example like in Gaza, at the end, in the very first beginning, the war between Israel versus Palestine or Taliban, for example, in Gaza, for example. But at the end of the day, the problem becomes bigger because of the involvement of the allies like United States in Gaza. They send the troops, they send the weapons, and then the war become bigger, even bigger. And what will be happen? Starving also bigger. Many victims there. Many people died, ladies and gentlemen, because of the situation. And we don't want to worsen the scenario or the situation because of the political agenda of some of what's called developed countries like United States by sending the military support, offer the disaster relief, and this is what we don't want as the what's called as the humanitarian movement, who is also stands with the international aid principle. And at the first beginning, our team already stated the case on how we want to stand to uphold the principle of aid. But because of why? Because in the status quo, most of those countries or the institution or the United Nations, they make just also what's called bring the agenda of helping to stop the war, but the reality it doesn't stop the war. It instead of creating a bigger war or is escalating the war at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. This is what we believe that it doesn't meet the requirements of giving international aid to this gentlemen. And in our proposal, we don't want to eliminate military support in total, but we just want to prioritize disaster relief first over military support. If you want also give the military support, if for example you see a very urgent situation like in Gaza, that's maybe such a but believe me, we also believe that at the very first your priority should be disaster relief. If you see the famine, for example, like in the Indonesian governments, they always declare about helping Gaza, helping Palestine, but they don't even think about people are starving in their own countries, ladies and gentlemen. And this is become something, ladies and gentlemen, implemented uh, uh, in the name of argument as the second speaker. Now we believe that how if prioritizing the military support over the disaster relief, we believe that worst scenario and worst situation will be happen. As I mentioned by the first speaker, the war becomes, but I'm going to focus on how it also affect to their own countries, the origin countries, for example, the state of America. Uh, in economic stability in United States of America also become destructive because of this kind of the what's called aid. Because of the government only support the military support, they send the troop, send the weapon, which is not cheap, but this very expensive. This spend a lot of fundings and budget toward this kind of the aid, and but they forget about the countries, their society, the people. You can see how in Serbia, many people are dying because of the overdoses because they are homeless, they don't have job, proper job. Of the day, it's difficult for them to survive. They are starving us. But because of the political ambitions of the United States sending the troops to show how strong the military, for example, showing the what's called sending the weapon to some conflicted countries like Ukraine and also what's called Israel, and but they forget about the domestic problem, in this case, about their own society. And this is not fair for their society. And also believe that it leads to the global instability, as has been mentioned in the previous speaker. And we believe that very bad if you let them always prioritizing the military support over disaster relief because of that proud. Okay, to respond to arguments, I would like to call upon the second of the oppositions, the first cell.
All right, am I audible?
Yes, you are clear.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, my teammate has shown you why military aid should not be seen as less important than disaster relief. I will continue our case by explaining the key reasons why security and military support must come first. But before that, let me quickly reply to the government. Proposition may bring up like Afghanistan saying military aid failed there, but Afghanistan shows the opposite. The moment military support left, the Taliban took over. Women lost their rights and the economy collapsed even further. The problem was not that security doesn't matter. The problem was it wasn't done well, and no amount of food or medicine could solve the fact that armed groups control the country. The lesson from Afghanistan is clear. Disaster relief without security changes nothing. If you want aid to work, you must prioritize safety first. And then the government side of the house says military aid make war worse. But that is only one side of the story. Military aid isn't just weapons, it's peacekeepers, escorts, demining, and protecting refugees. These actions reduce violence, not increase it. And think about this. When there is no balance, wars actually get worse faster. In Bosnia, without NATO intervention, ethnic cleansing would have killed thousands more. Military support stopped the massacres and forced to peace talks. In Sierra Leone, it ended a brutal civil war. Yes, sometimes military aid is misused, but that is about politics, not the principle. Humanitarian aid is also stolen or misused, but we don't abandon it. The truth is, with responsible use, military aid prevents the very disasters the proposition fears. All right, and then they told us about disaster relief saves lives immediately. That sounds good in theory, but in reality, if the area is unsafe, that aid never reaches the people. They also said military aid only makes wars longer. But if we ignore security, the humanitarian crisis grows much bigger. So their logic doesn't hold. Now, let me respond to the biggest worry from the government side. They said if we prioritize military aid, people will be left behind in disasters like earthquake, floods, or typhoons. They worry that victims will be suffer without urgent help. We are not saying disaster relief is unimportant. We fully agree that disaster relief must be given. People need food, water, and medicine in times of crisis. But our point is this: relief alone is not enough if the area is unsafe. Military aid doesn't replace disaster relief, it makes disaster relief possible. Think about this way. Disaster relief is like medicine for a patient, but military support is the doctor who makes sure that the medicine actually reaches the patient safely. If you only send medicine but the patient never receives it, what is the point? So the government's worry is based on a false picture. We are not ignoring humanitarian needs. We are making sure those needs can actually be met. By prioritizing military aid where necessary, we ensure that disaster relief reaches people effectively and that future disasters are prevented. Now, let me explain our argument in more detail. Let's picture what disaster relief really looks like in an unsafe country. Imagine a convoy of trucks loaded with food, medicine, and clean water heading towards a city in crisis. People in that city are hungry, injured, and desperate for help. But on the road, these trucks don't just drive freely. They pass through areas controlled by armed groups. At any moment, those groups can stop the trucks, steal everything, or even kill the drivers. Now, let's say the trucks somehow make it into the city. The danger doesn't end there. If the streets are full of fighting, if bombs are still failing, or if gunfire is echoing outside, how can ordinary civilians come out of their homes to collect the aid? They are too afraid. They know that one wrong step could can cause them die. So the food, the medicine, the water, it just sits there unshoot while people continue to suffer. And this isn't just a story; it's a reality. It's a reality. For example, in Syria, humanitarian agencies openly admit they could not enter certain towns without military escorts because they would be kidnapped, attacked, or killed. Aid was stuck at the border while people inside were starving. And then in Haiti's 2010 earthquake, planes full of relief supplies landed at the airport, but there was no proper security to distribute them. The aid piled up while people on the streets were desperate. Only while international militaries came into the restore order did the supplies start reaching community fairly. And then in West Africa, during the Ebola outbreak, the danger was not balance, but chaos and panic. Local health system collapsed and aid workers couldn't move safely. The US military and others had to build treatment centers, secure the areas, and provide logistics. Without that military support, doctors would never have been able to contain the epidemic. Now, what do these real cases tell us? They teach us one simple but powerful lesson. Disaster relief cannot succeed without security. It doesn't matter how much food you donate, how many medicine kits you prepare, or how many tanks you send. If there is no safety, those supplies will not reach the people who need them. That is where military aid comes in. Military support is not about fighting for the sake of war. It's about creating the conditions where humanitarian aid can actually function. Soldiers can secure the roads. They can guard convoys. They can protect aid workers. They can stabilize airports and ports so supplies flow smoothly. In short, like military support is the shield that allows humanitarian relief to reach its target. When the government side says prioritize disaster relief over military aid, they are imagining a perfect world where aid moves freely, where everyone cooperates when there is no danger. But the real world is not like that. In the real world, with a security, disaster relief is just boxes sitting in a warehouse, or trucks hijacked on the road, or food routing on an airport runway. Military support is the difference between aid arriving and aid failing. And then second, military aid can prevent bigger disaster. When we talk about disaster, most people think of like, okay, maybe just not just the natural war, earthquake, floods, hurricanes, but wars are also disaster. And in many cases, there are far worse. Wars don't just kill soldiers on a battlefield; they destroy the foundation of entire societies. Yes, and then when think about it, when a war breaks out, hospitals are bombed, schools are closed, farmland is abandoned, and millions of people flee their homes. Refugee camps grow overnight, stretching resources in neighboring countries. Children starve not because there is no food in the world, but because conflict blocks it from reaching them. The economy collapses, and ordinary families who once had stable lives are thrown into poverty and desperation. Now, here's the crucial point. Like These are not a short-term problem. A flood might destroy a city for weeks, but a war can ruin a whole nation for decades. For example, the conflict in Syria created over 6 million refugees who still cannot return home even after more than 10 years. That is not just earthquake, that is a disaster. This is where military aid becomes vital. Military support can stop conflicts from spreading further and reduce the scale of these humanitarian tragedies. And then let's look at Ukraine. Without military support from its allies, Ukraine would likely have collapsed under invasion. That collapse would not only mean destroy cities, but also million more refugees flooding into Europe, straining schools, hospitals, and social system across the continent. So, military aid in this case is not just about defending borders, it is about preventing a humanitarian catastrophe on a scale far larger than any natural disaster. So, in our side of the house, we believe that by providing military aid, by prioritizing providing a military aid, we can reach more better. Uh, we can get like a more better safety area. Thank you.
Okay, okay. Okay, the second spend 8:22 seconds. Excellent. Okay. Kita ganti link dulu tinggal 1 menit sisanya di sini. Oke.